Hello everyone, and welcome to another session in human biology. In this session we're going to talk about Chapter 11, the urinary system. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right on in. So the urinary system is composed of the anatomical elements of your kidneys, the ureters, the microscopic nephrons, which are found in the kidneys, adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys, the ureters, which exit out of the kidneys, the urethra, and the bladder. So those are the elements of it. What you're looking at here is that in this image here, this is a nice healthy kidney. This kidney, on the other hand, is not a healthy kidney. This is a kidney that is inflamed and will need to be replaced because it is no longer functioning and filtering things properly as it should be. So here are some points to ponder and things that we're going to discuss in this session. The different parts of the urinary system, the macroscopic, which are the organs themselves of the urinary system, and the microscopic structure of the kidneys, which include the nephrons, the way that urine is formed, how kidney is involved in regulating your water and salt balance, and we'll talk about two different hormones there, aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone, and we'll also talk about the acid-base balance of blood, some disorders of the kidneys, how kidney failure is treated, how the kidney is involved in maintaining homeostasis, specifically in its role in maintaining that water-salt balance and that acid-base balance. So some structures or the organs of the urinary system include first the kidneys, which are two bean-shaped organs that are found, what we call retroperitoneal, are in the back of the peritoneum. And so if you kind of put your hands towards your back, that's where your kidneys would be found. This is the first site where urine is formed. You can live with just one kidney, but it's optimal to have two kidneys, and it works better that way. There are two ureters that are small muscular tubes that carry urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The bladder, which is an expandable temporary storage unit for urine, and the urethra, which is a longer tube in men than in women. Women have a much shorter urethra. That's why women are more likely to get urinary tract infections. That carries urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. And here's just a pretty picture of showing all of those different structures. Now, the previous slide didn't really discuss the adrenal glands, but they're very important in the production of urine and water-salt balance because they produce a hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone's job is to retain sodium ions. And whenever sodium ions are retained, water is also going to be retained as well. Then we have our kidneys, the paired organs to the left and the right of the body. The ureters coming out of the kidneys, the bladder, and then the urethra coming out of the bladder to exit outside of the body. So what are the functions of the urinary system? Well, there are 5 functions that we want to take note of. Excretion of metabolic wastes, such as uric acid, creatine, and urea. Maintenance of the water-salt balance, so making sure there is the appropriate concentration of sodium and chloride ions, and there are also an adequate supply of water. Maintenance of the acid-base balance, so not too many hydrogen ions, not too many bicarbonate ions, which act as buffer. Also secretion of the hormones renin and erythropoietin. Erythropoietin we've talked about already, in that this is the hormone that's responsible for making red blood cells, and renin's job is to help to maintain blood volume and blood pressure. And also the reabsorption of filtered nutrients and the synthesis of vitamin D. So the first role, the kidneys of excretion. So we want to get rid of these, what we call organic waste. And the 3 organic waste that we want to get rid of are mostly nitrogenous. So we have urea, which is made up primarily of the breakdown of proteins and the breakdown of amino acids from the liver. We have uric acid, which is primarily the breakdown of nucleotides. So adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, all of those nucleotides that we associate with DNA and RNA. So when they're broken down, we're left over with nucleic acid. And then creatine is made by your muscle cells from the breakdown of a stored form of energy that we call creatine phosphate. The second and third job of the kidneys are the maintenance of water and salt salt, and acid-base balance. These are what we consider homeostatic mechanisms, that it's important to maintain homeostasis in the body, and one of the ways that the kidneys does that is by making sure that the water-salt balance is maintained because it helps to maintain the blood pressure and the blood volume. The kidneys are going to excrete hydrogen ions, which have a very acidic pH, and that acidic pH that allows the kidneys to secrete, the acidic pH of the hydrogen ions that are secreted by the kidneys is what allows for your urine to be acidic. Instead of secreting out bicarbonate ions, we want to reabsorb them. So anytime in this chapter where we talk about secretion, think about that as exiting out of the body, and reabsorption is where we're retaining it and keeping it to put it back into the bloodstream because we can use it. So excess hydrogen ions we really can't use very much because it's going to cause the pH of our blood to become more acidic. We want the pH of our blood to stay slightly basic at about 7.3, 7.4. Bicarbonate ions will be reabsorbed because it helps us to maintain that blood pH of 7.4. So bicarbonate ions are more basic in nature, and it helps to tie up excess hydrogen ions to ensure that our pH doesn't get too high. The hormone renin is secreted by the kidneys, and it allows the adrenal glands to secrete aldosterone, which further helps to regulate water-salt balance. Aldosterone is going to allow for the nephron to produce pumps that will actively reabsorb sodium and chloride ions, and then water will follow that. And erythropoietin is secreted by the kidneys to stimulate red blood cell production, and that happens primarily when the oxygen is low. You're going to always have low levels of erythropoietin, of that hormone, being secreted by the kidneys. However, when oxygen levels are really low, we have even higher secretion of that hormone. The urinary system is also responsible for reabsorbing filtered nutrients. So in one part of the nephron, the functional filters of the kidneys, it kind of tosses everything out. So some of the things that get tossed out, things like glucose and proteins and lipids, we want to reabsorb. Vitamin D is a molecule that promotes calcium absorption from the digestive tract, and it's synthesized as part of the urinary system. So the bladder itself is just it's made out of what we call transitional epithelial cells, and it's an expandable organ that stores urine. There are two sets of sphincters in the bladder, internal sphincters and external sphincters. The sphincters are contracted in order to keep the bladder closed until they are relaxed consciously, and one set of sphincters unconsciously when you go to the bathroom. There's an expandable wall of the bladder that contains two layers of circular smooth muscle fibers and two layers of longitudinal muscle fibers. The lining of the bladder is what we call transitional epithelium, which allows the bladder's mucosa, or the inside lining of the bladder, to expand and then retract back to its original form. So it can fill with urine, and then once it's emptied out, go back to its original form several times throughout the day. The filling activates the stretch receptors and signals the spinal cord to release one set of those sphincters, and that's the sensation or the urge of I've got to go potty. As a civilized person, you've been potty trained, if you will, so you don't just release that second sphincter whenever you have the urge. You have been taught or trained to control it until you get to a restroom. So here we have the external sphincters and the internal sphincters here. When the bladder is full, it's going to send a message to the spinal cord and to the brain, and then that message comes back down to the external sphincters, and you're taught and you use your brain to help control that sphincter. Before you're potty trained, whenever that signal that says I have to go is triggered, you just go. So the three different regions of the kidney are the outer portion of the kidney, the renal cortex. We have the renal medulla, which is the inner portion of the kidney. It's cone-shaped tissue in sections or masses that we call renal pyramids. And then we have the renal pelvis, which is the center area of the kidney where the ureter is going to come out of. All of the nephrons will take the filtrate that they've made, or the pre-urine that they've made, dump it into the collecting ducts, which will land in the renal medulla, and then come out of the renal calyces, or the minor and the major calyces, and then meet all up at the renal pelvis, where they exit out of the ureters. So here's a pretty picture of the anatomy of a kidney. Down here we have an actual gross anatomical photograph of a kidney. The cortex is on the outside, and we see that we have some nephrons that primarily hang out in the cortex, and we have some nephrons that hang a little bit lower in the medulla. The nephrons, remember, are the functional filtration units of the kidneys themselves. The medulla are all of these darkened pink areas, and each of them is called a renal pyramid. That renal pyramid, inside of it are the loops of the nephrons, whether they're primarily in the cortex or whether they're primarily in the medulla, and then you have the collecting ducts. The collecting ducts will collect the urine, or the filtrate. It's another name for pre-urine before it's actually out of your body or into the bladder itself. The collecting ducts collect all of the filtrate, or the pre-urine, from the nephrons, and it empties into this renal pelvis. Or actually, this is the renal papilla that it leaks out of. And then from that renal papilla, they all come into the renal pelvis and exit out of the ureters. So the nephrons, we've talked about them quite frequently, but we really haven't given a full-fledged definition as to what a nephron is. A nephron is a microscopic functional filtration unit of the kidney that produces urine. Each kidney has over 1 million nephrons. So here we have a picture of a nephron, and all nephrons have these same parts to them. We have a glomerulus, also known as Bowman's capsule, which is the first site of filtration. We have the proximal convoluted tubule, where some items will be reabsorbed back into circulation or put back into the bloodstream in these peritubular capillaries. Other things that don't get reabsorbed are going to be secreted. And remember, when we use the term secreted, that means that it's going to be part of the filtrate. And filtrate is just a fancy word for pre-urine. We don't call it urine yet because we haven't made the chemical compositional changes that need to happen in order for it to be coined urine. And then we go down into the loop of Henle, also known as the nephron loop. We have a descending loop and an ascending loop. The descending loop is primarily permeable to water. The ascending loop is going to pump out sodium and chloride ions. Then we have our distal convoluted tubule, which makes some fine adjustments, makes sure that organic waste, things like urea and uric acid, stay in the filtrate or stay in the pre-urine, and then we reabsorb some water, and the same thing for the collecting duct. More water reabsorption, more fine-tuning of the urine, so by the time that the filtrate reaches the collecting duct, we would call it urine at this point. So those structures of the nephron that I just went over, the glomerulus is a knot of capillaries inside of what we call Bowman's capsule, or a glomerular capsule, which produces the blood filtrate. So everything gets kicked out of the blood except for red blood cells, white blood cells, and plasma proteins. So the consistency of the filtrate at this point is about the same as that of blood plasma, minus the plasma proteins. Next area we have is the proximal convoluted tubule, which is a layer of epithelial cells that allow for reabsorption from the contents of the filtrate. So things like glucose and proteins and carbohydrates were secreted out by the glomerulus. It was all thrown out of the bloodstream. Well, the proximal convoluted tubule helps to bring some of those things back into circulation. Then we have the loop of the nephron, also known as the loop of Henle. It's a U-shaped structure that has a descending limb that allows water to leave, and an ascending limb that goes up that pushes salt out. Distal convoluted tubule, like the proximal convoluted tubule, is made of epithelial cells. They're very rich in mitochondria, and as a result, there is a movement of the molecules from the blood to the tubular secretion. So more fine-tuning adjustments of the filtrate, of things coming out of the nephron tube and things going in. And in the collecting ducts, there are several nephrons that will share one collecting duct, and their primary job is to carry urine to the renal pelvis, which makes its way to the ureters, and onto the bladder and to the urethra and out of the body. So how does a nephron form urine? So first we have glomerular filtration, so everything is going to be tossed out, and notice how all those arrows are showing everything out. So water, urea is going to stay out of there. Some water is going to stay out, but not all of it. glucose, amino acids, uric acid, salts, some of which we're going to reclaim. The proximal convoluted tubule is going to start the reclaiming process or the reabsorption process of things primarily such as glucose and some salts, and some of those amino acids will come back in there. And that process of reabsorbing some things will happen all along the nephron loop. When it gets reabsorbed, it goes back into these peritubular capillaries that we see surrounding the nephron. The nephron's kind of a light blue color. So tubular reabsorption for things like nutrients and salt molecules are going to be brought back into circulation through the convoluted tubules and put into those peritubular capillaries, and then the water is just going to passively flow through there. From this descending loop, water goes out and goes into those peritubular capillaries. From the ascending loop, you have sodium and chloride that will go out, which is what drives the water out of this side. And then tubular secretion. Certain ions and molecules like hydrogens and penicillin are actively going to be secreted and put into the filtrate, and they're going to make their way into the collecting duct. So by the time we get to this urine, it consists of water, urea, uric acid, some salts, ammonia. Ammonia is what gives urine its characteristic smell, and creatine. Urine, believe it or not, when it leaves your body, is actually sterile. Now, once it touches any part of your body or the toilet, it then becomes contaminated with bacteria. So the smell that you get from urine are from the ammonia ions that have been secreted by the body and put into the urine. So the three different processes of urine formation are glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion, all of which we have talked about on this previous slide here, where we talked about the role of each part of the nephron and what gets reabsorbed and what gets secreted. And furthermore, we talked about it additionally throughout the session. So glomerular filtration, water, small molecules are going to move from the glomerulus through the glomerular capsule. Remember, the glomerulus is just a knot of capillaries, afferent and efferent arterioles, or blood vessels. Large molecules and formed elements of the blood remain in the glomerular blood, but everything else, water, nitrogenous waste, uric acid, urea, creatine, even nutrients such as glucose and amino acids and salt ions are all going to become part of the filtrate. The way that I like to think of glomerular filtration is the way that I clean out my garage in spring cleaning. When I clean out my garage, I throw everything out except for what's absolutely necessary. So the cars can stay, the lawnmower can stay, the weed whacker, some major tools can stay, and the kids' bikes that they're currently riding, that can all stay. Everything else goes out. So the wood bench my husband said he was going to fix 6 months ago, that goes out into the garage sale. A tricycle that my 8-year-old no longer rides, that goes out to the garage sale. So I put everything out. Now, some of those items, my husband will say, or my children will say, they can actually use. So along the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule, those are going to be members of my family that are going to gradually start to bring things back into the garage, or for in the case of the nephron, we're gradually bringing things back into circulation to be kept by the body because it can be used. Tubular secretion and reabsorption. Many molecules and ions are reabsorbed, so remember that's my husband and my children bringing things back into the garage. And they're put back into circulation or put back into the blood. So things that are reabsorbed most commonly are most of the water gets reabsorbed, those nutrients, amino acids, and glucose, and then those required salt ions, things like sodium, chloride, and just a little bit of potassium, not a whole lot of it, and bicarbonate ions. Things that are going to not be reabsorbed but that are going to be secreted are hydrogen ions, nitrogenous waste, organic nitrogenous wastes such as uric acid, urea, and creatine, and then excess salt ions, potassium ions, primarily some chloride ions that we just don't need anymore. So tubular secretion is the second way that we remove substances such as drugs, penicillin, excess hydrogen ions, and creatine, which is a byproduct of creatine phosphate used for muscle contractions, that we get those out of the body. So the urinary system in homeostasis big job of the urinary system and how it maintains homeostasis is that it's maintaining the water salt balance, and it's also maintaining the consistency of the blood and getting rid of some of those toxins or drugs through the urine, and it also helps to maintain the acid-base balance of the blood by getting rid of excess hydrogen ions and reabsorbing more of these bicarbonate or these buffer ions to help maintain the blood pH. I'm not going to go over every last part of this image because I believe we've seen it several times before, but I will give you all a moment to kind of read over and digest it, and this is an image that's also found in your textbook. So the way that the kidneys maintain homeostasis is that they excrete waste, these big three we've talked about, urea, creatine, urea acid, regulate salt-water balance, and that helps to regulate not only your blood volume, but also your blood pressure. If your volume gets too low, then your pressure will get too low, and conversely, if your volume is too high, your pressure can get too high. Regulates the acid-base balance of the blood by regulating the pH and ensuring that we have the appropriate combination of hydrogen and bicarbonate ions, and it also provides assistance to other systems, including your endocrine system, cardiovascular, skeletal, muscle, nervous, and digestive. So the juxtaglomerular apparatus is where the afferent arteriole and the distal convoluted tubule are going to touch one another. At this point, very important thing happens here, that hormone renin is going to be released, which causes the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys to release aldosterone, which will trigger the ascending loop of the nephron to actively pump out sodium and chloride so that we can actively retain or reabsorb more water, as well as reabsorbing the sodium and the chloride. So this is our juxtaglomerular apparatus here. And then this is where we have the point where the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole comes into the glomerulus, and then we have the efferent arteriole that leaves out of it. So where it touches here, this point here is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And it's touching that distal convoluted tubule. So by touching it right there, it signals the adrenal glands to release renin, renin is released, and it signals the adrenal glands to release aldosterone so that we can have more of these pumps actively pumping out sodium and chloride ions to be put back into circulation, which then facilitates more water reabsorption. So how is blood volume and pressure maintained by the kidneys? Simply by the reabsorption of salt. And there are two ways that we can do that, using aldosterone. Actually, primarily using aldosterone, we can reabsorb salt that way, promotes the excretion or the removal of potassium ions and reabsorb sodium ions instead. And atrial natriuretic peptide, which is secreted by the heart when the blood volume gets too high, it inhibits the action of aldosterone, which is going to do the opposite. So with atrial natriuretic peptide, it's going to do the opposite of aldosterone. So instead of retaining sodium ions, it's going to cause the body to get rid of it. So we would do that if the blood volume is too high and the blood pressure gets too high. The blood pressure is too low, then that could be an indication that perhaps the volume is too low. So we want to have aldosterone save more sodium ions, and water follows salt. The more sodium ions that you reabsorb, the more water that you'll reabsorb. The more water you put back into circulation, the higher your blood volume, the higher your blood volume, the higher your blood pressure. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if your pressure is too high, then we want to try to reduce the volume any way we can. An atrial natriuretic peptide that's released by the heart is going to prevent aldosterone from releasing the adrenal glands from releasing aldosterone, so we don't save as much sodium, we don't pull in as much water, we can bring down the volume and thus bring down the pressure. So blood volume, how is blood volume and pressure maintained by the kidneys? By establishing a solution gradient. There's a greater concentration towards the inner medulla, and then reabsorption of water. Due to that sodium, or that solute concentration, or that solute concentration of sodium ions, water leaves the descending limb of the loop, and then another hormone, antidiuretic hormone from the pituitary gland, is going to determine exactly how much water you save. A diuretic is something that causes you to go pee, want to go to the bathroom. Antidiuretic is going to retain water. So the more antidiuretic that is released, the more concentrated your urine is going to be and the lower the volume of it. The more antidiuretic hormone that is released, you'll have larger volumes of this dilute urine. So here's just a picture of some of this water reabsorption that happens along the length of the nephron. And at this point, antidiuretic hormone would be the primary player in how much of this water comes and is reabsorbed along this area and this area. That is the job of the hormone aldosterone. So alcohol is actually going to prevent antidiuretic hormone secretion, and thus it increases the amount of urine and the amount of dehydration. So buffers are chemical compounds that we want to save somewhat. Bicarbonate is one such buffer, and what bicarbonate does is it ties up excess hydrogen ions in order for us to maintain our blood pH, and you're left with a compound known as carbonic acid. When hydroxyl ions are added to the blood, then they will combine with that carbonic acid and break down into bicarbonate ions and water. So really this is just a picture of showing how buffers work to help maintain that pH of 7.4. The respiratory centers of the brain can also increase the breathing rate if the pH buffers cannot maintain it, and we call that respiratory compensation of acidosis or alkosis. But ultimately, it's the kidneys that are responsible for maintaining this pH. So if we have bicarbonates in the nephron tubule, we want to reclaim them and put them in the capillaries. And excess hydrogen ions, we want to put those into the filtrate to become part of the urine, where they will combine with an amino group and become an ammonia ion, which is secreted out of the urine and gives the urine its characteristic smell. So kidney function disorders, diabetes, hypertension, or high blood pressure, and some inherited conditions are the most common causes of renal diseases and failures. Urethritis is a local infection of the urethra, sometimes just known as a urinary tract infection. Cystitis is an infection of the bladder, and polynephritis is an infection of the kidneys. And so what we were looking at in that very first slide was an example of polynephritis, which is a very inflamed kidney. Kidney stones are hard granules formed in the renal pelvis due to urinary tract infections or an enlarged prostate. pH balances or the intake of too much calcium can cause kidney stones as well. And uremia is a high levels of urea and other waste products which should be in the urine. They're instead found in the blood. And it can cause very serious conditions where the water and salts are retained due to excessive nephron damage. So that we're not really, the nephron is not functioning the way that it does because we have all of these other waste products that are circulating. And the way that we can treat kidney failure is with a dialysis machine, which I'm sure most of you have pretty much heard of before. It's an artificial kidney machine used to subtract and add substances to the blood in much the same way that a kidney would. We have continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, where a peritoneal membrane filters the blood and allows the person to go about their normal day without having to sit in a dialysis center for several hours a week. And then we can also have kidney replacement surgery, where we just replace a single kidney, and we have very high success rates of this procedure. All right, and that's everything for this chapter. Have a great day.